Well, good day, everyone, and welcome to an FS Club webinar. I'd like to claim it's taking place in London, but it's taking place in London around me, while Toby Corballis, who many of you will know from a previous program, is en route to the Netherlands. And Anuka, who's joining us today, is leaving Washington, D.C., where she is at some point in the near future, and heading to South Africa. So we're sort of everywhere and nowhere, which I think is a great introduction to leadership of self, an introduction to mindfulness and inner resilience for new modes of working. Well, you'll all know me, I suspect, Michael Mainelli. I'm one of the directors at Yen, and it really is my privilege to be able to introduce and chair many of the webinars that we have here in FS Club. And that's really just thanks to our sponsors. We have an enormously tolerant set of sponsors who let us range widely and freely across technology, economics, and finance. My shorthand for today will be mindfulness as a subject, although our two guests will explain this in much more detail. But what I'd like to say is this is a bit on the edge of our envelope, but we have held events on mindfulness in the past, and they've been extremely well received. And I think it's an important concept for those of us who are trying to manage in what are certainly uncertain times and in many cases very difficult times of change. So I think there's a lot that we can gain from today's presentation from Anuka and Toby. Now, as ever, it's fairly straightforward. Toby will kick off and then hand over to Anuka, and they will elaborate on the whole idea of mindfulness. We're hoping to keep 15, perhaps even 20 minutes for questions, answers, and discussion. And there's quite a bit to discuss on this subject, which has been gaining, I think, increasing prominence over the last 3 decades, probably for the reason that it works. And I must say, I myself am a minor a minor participant in this type of mindfulness work, but we're here to hear from the experts today. And my final point before we hand over to them is if you wish to ask questions or make comments or share an experience, please feel free to do so. Both Toby and Anuka would really like it, but would you use the GoToWebinar facility? No point in emailing me because I am, sorry, we seem to have a sound problem. No point in emailing me because I'm here online with you. So with that, if I can, I'd like to hand over to you, Toby.
Thank you, Michael. And it's great to have Anuka with me on this webinar today. I wonder if we could just move to the next slide. What we're going to talk about is really we're going to frame the conversation in the sense of having the organization as an entity, the teams within the organizations as an entity, and then, of course, the individual as an entity. And there's some great sort of similarities and correlations that we can draw between those. And we haven't got a lot of time, but hopefully we'll be able to draw out some of those. And at some point, Anuka, towards the end, is going to do a demonstration of a mindfulness technique so that people at home or in their office or wherever they are can follow along and be taught a technique that maybe is useful to use in their day-to-day lives. I wonder if I can move to the next slide. So I'll just introduce myself, and then Anuka will take over, and she's going to go through a few slides and then hand back to me. So my name's Toby Corballis. For those of you who don't know, I'm an organizational change expert. I host a podcast called Wicked Problems. I just recently published a book called Digital Leadership Delivered, very grandiose title, but there you go. I've been involved in 5 startups, 2 of which failed and 3 of which have been successful or continue to be successful. My postgraduate is in organizational leadership. I'm a qualified Kanban management professional, and I once fell off a mountain, about 300 meters, 1,000 foot. The mountain had the very good sense to get out of the way and not injure itself. So it was all very dramatic. And that's a sort of rough overview of who I am. I'm going to hand over to Anuka, but I'll be back with you in a minute. Anuka.
Thank you, Toby. Hi, everyone. I'm very grateful to be with all of you here today. And thank you, Michael, for that lovely introduction. So my name is Anuka Gazara-Anthony. I am a mindfulness teacher as well as an emotional intelligence coach, and I teach individuals, businesses and organizations tools and practices to help navigate through change management and other concerns that businesses go through using emotional intelligence practices. And I'm currently based here in Washington, D.C. So before we start, I want to do something a little bit fun where we're going to ask you to do a mindful poll. So we would like to ask you, what percentage do you think of time per day does the average person's mind wander? What percentage of time per day does the average person's mind wander? And we'll be giving you the answer towards the end of our webinar today, but we'd be very curious to see.
Okay. Anuka, we're just approaching 70% voting, so
Okay.
it's very clear this audience doesn't wander very far at all. Very, very alert. So I'm going to call the poll to a close, and
Okay, great.
you should be able to see the results here.
Oh,
It's
very
interesting.
yeah.
So 70% believing that people wander more than 40% of the time.
Good.
Great.
Okay, so just be mindful of that, everyone, when we lead back to that poll towards the end of the webinar. So let's move on now to the next slide. So why are we all here today? Why is it useful and important for us to acknowledge that mindfulness practices and emotional intelligence tools can help us cultivate resilience, especially in our teams, in our work and in our lives, where we're navigating a lot of uncertainty at the moment. So I also work for an organization called Search Inside Yourself, and the nickname for that is Silly. And over the years at Silly, we've always been putting across this term VUCA world, okay? And as you can see here, VUCA stands for volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And interestingly, it was also a term that was developed by the US Army to describe warlike conditions. But as you can see now, these are very much terms that address the life that we're living in. And so studies show that because we are balancing such volatility and such chaos, that can very much affect our ability to focus and our ability to perform. So let's look at now, how does this affect the way that we manage our problems within our leadership roles and within teams?
Anuka, thank you. So I'm going to go through a couple of slides now where I'm going to try and frame that sort of VUCA world, if you will, in the organizational context and the team-based or structural context. And then we'll delve down again with Anuka's help into the sort of individual and leaders' own domain. And one of the things we all come across in this volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous world is problems. And that's what a lot of organizations set out to solve. And then within those organizations, they have problems that they need to solve internally. And a while back, Horst Rittel and Melvin Weber came up with a theory of problems where they talked about problems as being classifiable into 3 domains. So the first of those was a critical problem, and that's a problem where you have to solve the problem now. You don't really have time to think or plan. And a good example of that recently was the COVID-19 lockdown. Boris Johnson announces that, or whichever country you're in, your leader announces that you've got to stay at home from now on, and there's no going into work or whatever. So you don't have time to plan for that. You've got to just mobilize things to get people to be able to work from home. That's a critical problem because you haven't been able to plan for it. You've got to deal with it. The second type of problem is a tame problem. So deja vu, you've seen it before. These can be very complex. Right? It doesn't mean that they're not complex, but the solution is known, and that's the critical point. Right? And it may be something like, for instance, building a building. Right? It's a complicated thing to do, but if you have the architectural plans and you have the the builders and the people who know how to do it, the plumbers, etc., it can be done. And there's a sequence of steps that you go through to do it. And then the third type of problem is the wicked problem. Not wicked because it's evil, but wicked because it's seemingly unsolvable. So you've never seen this problem before. It may be contextual in some cases. So it may be that you've never seen it, somebody else has, and in that case you can tame it by going and seeking out the experts. But very often you haven't. These problems tend to sit between and across departments. They have hidden impacts, and there's often no obvious stopping condition. These problems tend to be the problems that we come up against in business and and very often at a personal level all the time, and they create a cognitive dissonance because we don't know how to solve them. And very often what we do is we track back to things that are comfortable in our tame problems world, but these solutions aren't really appropriate. Can I go on to the next slide, please? There's no way I can tell you what leadership is. I should say that full stop. But we can explore the concept. We're not going to get very far in a very short time that we have here now. But we'll go over some sort of conceptual understanding of what it is over the next couple of slides, and also drill down a bit into that. But so leadership is very definitely about establishing engaging visions. It's about understanding not just the detail on the floor, but also what's happening from the balcony. How are things working at the macro as well as the micro level? Setting your agendas, selecting people for their skills potential, not their personality, right? Being able to communicate, and so on and so on. But it's also about, on the left-hand side, very much, I believe, and I think we need more of this perhaps sometimes, but about acting with honesty, integrity, decency, ethics, and fairness. And that's towards other people in teams, it's towards our colleagues who may be not on our team, but they're still in the same organization. It's towards our clients, of course, and towards our competitors, and also towards ourselves. And I think that last one especially is often missed. We stop and think about ourselves too infrequently. And we do that, I think, to our chagrin. I wonder if we could take the next slide, please. And there's a sort of, this is John Cotter's definition, but the difference between leadership and management, where leadership is about sense making, direction finding, alignment, motivation, inspiration, you mobilizing for opportunity, but as management is about doing those things that we know how to do and doing them very well. It's the stuff that we churn over day after day after day. It's planning when we need to plan. It's budgeting when we need to plan, and so on. And that there is a difference between the two. And I think very often what happens is people think a lot about the management side, even when they're trying to wear a leadership head, and it creates again this sort of cognitive dissonance and this inability or where people, the sort of situation where people don't think enough about themselves, the context they're in, and the sort of what it means to breathe and take a moment and move forward. And what happens is, if you have strong leadership, but you don't have strong management, then you get very innovative, adaptive, energetic, but chaotic systems. And that actually is okay maybe in a small startup, right? And the corollary of that is, well, you can have strong management, no leadership, and you get well run, and as we've all come across, I'm sure, in our lives, bureaucratic, but unable to change quickly. And that's, you need the two to combine in order to create good leadership. And if we just move on. So where are we with leadership at the moment, and why are we thinking about mindfulness in respect to leaders? Well, here's the challenge, right? We're all walking the COVID-19 tightrope. At the level, ostensibly, it's easy. One person per rope, don't look down, keep your balance. But the problem that's happened, the reality is, everyone's on the same rope and everyone's looked down all at once. And nobody knows quite how to deal with that situation. If we just move on, please. And that creates an imbalance. What happens is with this, when an imbalance is that, all the different variables we have in our businesses, the quality, the speed of delivery, the predictability of what we're doing, the quantity of product that we can create and sell and move with, the value that we deliver to our clients, they all get affected somehow. So when the variables are balanced, and quite often ego comes into that. And when the variables are balanced, the system flows. Okay, the cars are all there, they're moving, and it's all fine. But when there's an imbalance, a problem occurs, and things get backed up, and they become problems. And I want us to talk now, take it down to the team level, where we talk about the Tuckman model, right? When teams get together, they're forming, there's little agreement, unclear on purpose, they test each other's boundaries, they go through a storming phase where there's a bit of conflict, there's some resistance to what the team structure may be, and then you get this normalizing period where actually they start to adopt their own standards, they start to recognize the interpersonal value of what's happening, and they start to become a cohesive team, and then they go into the performing phase where interpersonal structure becomes a tool in itself. And the roles that people have, maybe I've got a title, but maybe I do more than just that title because people recognize what I'm good at and what I'm not good at. And I won't go on to the adjourning phase. I think that's sort of self-describing. If we just move on to the next, because I think what's really interesting is if you look at the shape of that chart and look at the shape of this one that Anuka's going to talk about, I think there's some great correlations. Anuka.
Yeah, thank you, Toby. So it's important for us to understand, Toby mentioned to you earlier the dangers of imbalances. And to understand that, it's really important for us to understand our emotional awareness and our emotional regulation. So this is a model that was taken by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. She actually designed it to help people understand their bereavement. And now it's been adapted for organizations and businesses who are working on change management. So if we look at it, if, for example, if we use the context that we're in this year, going through a pandemic, we start when we're facing change, going through this phase of shock where we either in this state of surprise or we're in this state of denial where it's disbelief and we're looking for evidence that probably isn't true. We then shift into this state of frustration where we start to recognize that things are a little bit different, and this can sometimes also provoke anger, and it can also create a sense of deep tiredness as well and exhaustion. This then leads to this mood of feeling very low, not having any energy, and really looking at the change with very negative anticipation. And it's important to recognize that when you're in that state of low mood and you're lacking in energy, that it also might take you a while for you to actually progress into that experimental phase. And when we're in that experimental phase, we're now realizing, okay, this change is going to be permanent. And now I have to slowly start engaging with that new environment, with that new territory. And the individual starts to make new decisions and really try new things as they're experimenting their way through this new change. Sorry, if you don't mind going back. This then leads to decision making where we're learning then how to work in this new situation. And this tends to help us feel a bit more positive. And this leads to then finally integrating that change and feeling like a renewed individual. But it's really important to note with this model that we may not all go through these phases in a very synchronized way, that actually there are individuals who may actually progress into the previous stages, depending on how communication levels are, and also depending how much support they get during these different stages as well. So let's move on now to this wonderful quote by Mary Shelley, and some of you may be familiar with her, She is a famous English novelist who wrote the book Frankenstein. And she writes, nothing is so painful to the human mind as a great and sudden change. So as human beings, although we are very social species, when it comes to change, sometimes we tend to like to be with the current situation. So we either get stuck with it or we feel like it in a state of disbelief and we try to ignore it. And to understand why we have those changes, it's important to understand how the brain reacts towards change. So there are many ways to look at different emotional reactions in the brain. And when we're undergoing pain or a threat or even a threat of change, it's our central executive network, which is made up of our prefrontal cortex, which is just behind our forehead, that's engaging with the limbic system, and it's communicating also with our amygdala, which is our brain's alarm system, which decides if we're going to flee or fight a threat. So these systems are constantly scanning for threat, and in the way that they perceive change is very much the same way. So we're perceiving change as a threat initially, and then we are simultaneously hardwired for connection. So can you imagine, we're holding this duality tension, right? So when we're faced with change, we're scanning for threat, and then we're also trying to figure out how do we feel heard and how do we feel part of the tribe and feel connected with each other as we're addressing this change. So we figured out through the increase now over the last decade or so in neuroscience research that actually there is a way to rewire our brain and to disrupt this neurocircuitry pathway that starts to form our biases and our perceptions. And this can be taught through mindfulness practices. So to recognize this process and its influences and the trajectory that it starts, it's important to understand the shift from autopilot to aware. So if we can move to the next slide. So when we're on this state of autopilot, we're actually in this state of automatic behavior. So much of the time, you may find that we're actually not really here. Like we're either disconnected from our senses because we are so absorbed with all the technology and the differences that we all have and roles that we have to navigate in addition to our work. And so when we run on autopilot, these are some of the traits that we may be facing, where we may be acting on behavior that's based on past habits, or we may be worrying about the future. So as human beings, we're very, very good about ruminating about the past or thinking about the future, but we're not very good at being present. And it's really important to know as well that being on autopilot is actually a very natural state, and it's something that we all go through. Other states can also be feeling distracted, being less aware of what's happening around you. And as I mentioned earlier, having acts that are based on habit patterns and assumptions. So some of you may have experienced sometimes driving the same road and then getting to the end of the road and not understanding how you got there because you've lost those, couple of seconds from your house to the end of the road. And that's being in the state of autopilot. So one way that we can address this, and the good news is that we can address this, and our brains are malleable, so we are able to rewire that neuroplasticity, is really summed up beautifully by this quote by Viktor Frankl that was summarized by a best-selling author, Stephen Covey, and where he said, between stimulus and response, there is this space, and it's in that space that is our power to choose our response. And in our response lies our growth and our freedom. And so that's what we're trying to cultivate when we're cultivating that, the start of our journey towards mindfulness, which is self-awareness. We're starting to really recognize that space between the response that we choose and the response that is really aligned with our values. So the definition of mindfulness is, if we can move to the next slide, is being aware. That is the most simplest definition of mindfulness. And actually in the UK, if we can move to the next slide, the government did a Mindful Nations UK report several years ago to understand how mindfulness practices could really help the public sector. And this is the definition that they summarized on their research on mindfulness. So mindfulness means paying attention to what's happening in the present moment. So it's paying attention to what's happening in the mind, in the body, as well as your external environment, but doing that with an attitude of curiosity and kindness. And that's really important to acknowledge, because when we're talking about curiosity and kindness, we're actually talking about compassion and self-compassion. And the research shows that self-compassion really helps our ability to be connected with another's suffering. And this has a huge impact on our brain and our body. Research actually shows that regular compassion practice is anti-inflammatory. So it actually decreases the molecules in our body that we know that are important in producing inflammation. So when you miss a day of exercise, or you have a really uncomfortable conversation with a client or a colleague that you wish that you could have changed, we really invite you to change your behavior the next day. So go back the next day and do something that brings joy in your life, and have that conversation, but with an attitude of curious and kindness. And these are the little small practices that really help cultivate resilience by helping you engage with something more meaningful beforehand. So I'm going to now show you a practice to really help you cultivate that focus and really increase your resilience. So this is called a stop practice. And what we're going to do is, in a moment, I'm going to lead you through it. But what I would like you to do now is just to take a couple of moments to bring something to mind that is causing difficulty in your life. So on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being really traumatic, I want you to think of something around 5, something that is just a little bit frustrating and it's causing you some concern and difficulty. So just bring that to mind now. Okay, good. And now I'd just like you to take one moment in your seat and just bring your awareness to your body. Just notice how your body is feeling. And now we're going to move to the observe part. So to be able to do that, we're going to take a breath, and then I'm going to invite you to take 3 more breaths, okay? So let's take a deep breath in, and then a deep exhale out. Good. And with your next breath now, I want you to focus on your body. Just take a moment to feel the breath within the body. And then exhale. Next breath now, I want you to think about your feelings. What's arising when you think of this experience that you brought to mind? And then let go. And then the next inhale now, I want you to think about your thoughts. What's going on in your head? What are the thoughts that are arising connected to this experience that you brought out? And then just let it go with an exhale. And then gently bring your awareness to your breath. And as you're doing that, just notice now, how does the experience feel in your body? And then notice what arises with how to navigate this experience that you brought to mind. By noticing how you feel about it within your body and where in your body you're feeling it. See if you can use that sensation to help you figure out the next step of how to navigate that experience. And then just gently let go of that practice, come back to your breath, breathing in and breathing out. And when you're ready, slowly open your eyes and come back into the room. So if we can move to the next slide, this is the observe part of the practice. So what you did is what we call a 3-center check-in. You use the first breath to think about what's happening in your body, the second breath to think about what's happening, you're noticing your feelings, and then the third breath, you're noticing your thoughts. And so if you find yourself in the office or in a moment of a difficult conversation with someone, this is a great micro practice to do in stealth to really help you to better respond to the situation rather than react instantly when you're feeling heightened emotion. So we're now going to go back to that wonderful poll that we asked you at the beginning, and Toby's going to share with you some science based on that poll.
So first of all, if you've got your results from before, we can do some revelations on the next slide. It will just move there. So answer time. The average time that people's minds wander is about 47% of the time. So then leaders report about 70% of the time, 70% of leaders report regularly unable to be attentive in meetings, right? So their minds wander in meetings. And only 2% regularly make time to enhance personal productivity. So those are quite interesting numbers, right? So that poll that we asked you about, the right answer was 47%. I think 31% of you guessed that. So well done if you were in that camp, but don't worry if you weren't. A lot of people guessed it was higher actually, and certainly for the attentiveness in meetings, that is true. The next slide, please. So it's really time for us to say thank you and move into Q&A, I think. Michael, are you there?
I most certainly am, and that's been absolutely super. Thank you very, very much, Anuka and Toby, and I'm mindfully relaxed as well. But the audience isn't, because they're still asking questions. So a quick one. Hugh Purser makes an observation that there are quite a few similarities between some of this and martial arts. Do either of you have martial arts experience? He's curious.
Yes, I do. Very little, but I used to do Shotokan karate, which is full contact karate, and also Krav Maga, which is an Israeli martial art.
Is that the one that takes on mountains, right?
That's the one, yeah, that's one where you in the mountain, better get out of the way, basically.
Yeah. And Anuka?
I don't, I'm afraid, but I can definitely see that correlation, because when you're doing martial arts, you're very much focusing your mind on how your body is moving in that moment. So there's different ways of cultivating mindfulness. Meditation is just one of the dedicated practices, but definitely something like martial arts or Tai Chi, that's another way of cultivating mindfulness through movement.
Ian, who's out in the westerly reaches of London, somewhere near the California fires probably, said that there was a fascinating piece in New Scientist last month suggesting that about 1 out of 12 people get a negative reaction to mindfulness. Does that accord with your experience? And how do you look out for the negative signs in that minority?
That's a really important question, and thank you, Ian, for mentioning that. And especially now, during COVID times, people very much find the breath can be very triggering or traumatic. So it's important that if you feel that way, that you use either the sensation of your feet on the ground, or you bring more awareness into your body and just noticing how your body is feeling on the surface or the chair that you're sitting on, in order to cultivate a more focused and present mindset.
Susan Cuff is curious, and I'm not sure I quite heard this. She's interested to hear you say that leaders should select for skills and potential, not personality. Surely the mix of personalities in a team is what makes it high or low performing and a place where people learn from each other, which makes teams so powerful.
Well, I think there's a truth to having different personalities in the team is a great thing. But I think what that statement's actually saying is don't select someone just because they're your mate, right? Or don't select someone just because they have the same mindset as you. The diversity and diversification of talent and personality and ability within a team is important.
Sue Algio would be interested in hearing from both of you on whether you think good leaders are born or made.
I'll let you lead with that, Toby.
Well, I'll start and you chime in. That's fine. Clearly, there are exceptional people in the world. I don't think anybody would argue that sort of Gandhi or Nelson Mandela were anything other than exceptional people, and a lot of that exceptionality came from within. But I think it's wrong to think that leadership can't be taught. It doesn't mean that some people don't have an innate talent for it, in the same way that some people have an innate talent for the piano or the violin, and others can be taught it. There are probably some people that don't want to be taught it, in the same way that there are some people who don't want to be taught violin. And there are definitely people who you don't want to teach violin. That's why I'm myself included, because it will just sound like a strangled cat. But I think it's a both and, actually. I think there are some people who are naturally born leaders and some people who can come to that leadership through being taught the various different aspects of it.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. That there are some, innate leaders out there that are born with these, wonderful qualities. But I think, looking at that from a mindfulness perspective, that we're learning through neuroplasticity, which is the ability of our mind to change its structure and formation based on mindfulness practice, that very much leaders can be made if they are given the tools to be able to do that. And we're seeing, when I teach the Search Inside Yourself leadership program to businesses, and the actual program actually was born at Google, and we see very much how, especially in the tech sector, a lot of CEOs are finding this incredibly helpful right now in helping not only understand the perspective of their staff better when it comes to changes, but also being able to support them with emotional intelligence and understanding their why they may have behavior and opinions to certain things and how they could better adapt to that.
Bob McDowell observes that routine is the antithesis of change, and he's kind of curious. A good question here. Because I noticed in your examination of the Kubler-Ross, of course, when you're at the rock bottom, you then begin experimentation. So Bob's curious, do either or both of you think routine should be discouraged, and if so, how?
Anuka, do you want to take that one first?
Yeah, sure. I actually feel that when it comes to mindfulness, actually, routine is really, really important, because if you're able to cultivate a regular routine, the neuroscience research shows us that makes it, you're more able to actually interconnect the practices, not only into your work life, but also into your personal life. But if you kind of disrupt your alignment of routine and tend to do it one day and not the other, that makes it less likely for you to really commit to making that change.
I think I'd just add that dogmatic routine is, I think, something I would encourage people to avoid. And that just because something works in one setting doesn't mean it will work in another setting. And if you look at organizational change, for example, self-organizing teams, if you look at things like agile, then the ethos there is, yes, there's all these tools that can help you, but just use the right ones in the right way for the team that you're in. And if it's not working, don't be afraid to change that routine. So introduce something else. And if something stops working, things can stop working later on. Don't be afraid to take that out of the equation.
Yeah, actually, that's a good point. Sorry, Mike, if I can just add to that as well, that especially now, well, a lot of us are navigating additional responsibilities onto our jobs. So if you find it's really difficult to integrate, example, that stop practice, like to take out dedicated time to really cultivate that, then try as best as you can to do it in the moment. Because that's a really good point that Toby made, is that sometimes the environment might not always be there and you might not have the time or the space to actually do that. So try as much as you can to integrate these kind of practices within your daily life, so you don't have to think of it as an additional thing that you have to do.
I think Bob anticipated some of this because he goes on with an extra question. How important is physical interaction? Does remote working change the speed and acceptance of change?
Personally, I think physical interaction is something that's very important because you get a lot of non-verbal signals in human interaction. And as good as Zoom and GoToMeeting and Skype and all these other great tools that we have these days, as good as they can't replace some of those non-verbal cues that we do rely on. And I think they are great tools. And I think we are in a situation where sometimes we're just going to have to rely on them for the moment. But no, I personally think there is a lot of benefit from physical interaction.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that. I agree personally as well that, we're wired as a social species. So, in order to cultivate better well-being when we're faced with challenges and chaos, that ability to connect with someone, even in a socially distanced way, can be really important in helping us become happier and healthier individuals.
Donald McCrae has got an interesting point back onto teams again. Teams are not chosen for their balance of behaviors. How do you cope with an unbalanced team? And he sort of leads you in a direction. Do you work out missing behaviors and ensure someone can begin to behave that way, or I would add, or do you just change the team?
Changing the team is a kind of last resort. I don't think you'd ever just change the team, but I'm more in favour personally of helping people understand what behaviours they're doing at the moment, what the effect of those behaviours are, and one of the ways you can do that is through simulations. Okay, so we can run simulations and say, if we keep doing this way, then what's going to happen? And helping people lead them to a change in their own behaviours if that's necessary. If that's something, and that necessity could be something necessary because it's something that will help them in their quest to become better at their role, or as a team member, it might help the team cohesion in itself. But yeah, there's lots of tools and simulations that we can run that help people establish what they're doing. And let's face it, I mean, people do things in a way, and it's rational for them to do it in that way because they've done it in that way, and that's what they've been taught. And so sometimes it's just a question of peeling back the scales from people's eyes because they don't know what they don't know.
Okay. Sue Algio has given me a lovely comment, which I think will sadly help us bring this to a close because we're over time and I'm getting all of those thank yous as people disappear. But she points out on the quote from Mary Shelley, isn't it true that on the contrary, for many people, extreme change is not painful, but stimulating and a driver of creativity? Your thoughts?
Sue, that's a very valid point. And for many people, yes, absolutely, they will embrace that change and they will adapt. But unfortunately, when we're also in an environment where we have to also deal with so much more uncertainty in addition to that change, that can be very, very hard and sometimes traumatic for people to process. So it's just really important to understand, why is it important to really cultivate that deep emotional awareness, because that's eventually going to help you with emotional regulation and be able to really adapt and make decisions that are more aligned with your values and purpose.
I'll just very quickly add to that. If you look at the Kotter model of change, it recognizes that from a team's perspective, you have a small percentage of people who really embrace the change always, and then you also, of course, at the other end of the spectrum have the naysayers, and then there's everything in between. So yes, right.
Well, sadly, I'm going to have to draw this to a close. Personally, I found it fascinating. As I say, I'm a mediocre practitioner of mindfulness techniques, probably read more about it than do. And so I think Toby's right. Get in there and mess around with your violin, your inner violin, get it moving. So I'll share with you my little secret, which is always the mantra I always do when I'm observing is what's going to be the next thing that comes into my mind. And I keep doing that, but everybody has their own technique that works. I think the second thing is we're going to be seeing, I suspect, quite a bit more on mindfulness as the research is now beginning to pour in. So the comment Ian Harris made about the New Scientist article, I'm anticipating quite a bit more research in the area, which will justify, validate, show some of the dangers. It's largely a safe practice, but it is one that some people do clearly have difficulty with. And finally, I think there's a lot of research to be done on how does mindfulness work in groups. We've spent a lot of time on presuming that if everybody was mindful, that would be better. Perhaps that's not true. Perhaps people should be having group sessions, or perhaps it should be rolled out organizationally wide, or whatever. So I'm anticipating a lot of new stuff, and I hope you'll come and share it with us in the future. But meanwhile, sadly, it turns me to bring things to a close with three quick thanks, if I may. First and foremost, our wonderful sponsors who allow us, as I say, to range widely and freely across topics of our choice. I've noticed quite a few of them online today, so I hope that they've appreciated it, and we hope to bring more of this type of thinking to the fore in our various areas. We, again, thanks to you, the audience. You've been particularly active today, and sending in some nice thanks, which I will pass on to both of our speakers. We do have a couple of things coming up tomorrow, where the Financial Services Group of Delivery Companies will be looking at anti-money laundering. Later in the week, we're going to be looking with data credit and employment-related securities. And next week, fascinating bit coming in from Canada, we're going to be looking at a quantum annealing computer in action, actually. And then the very, very famous in my space anyway of sustainability, Steve Wadegood from Aviva, a long-term and fervent practitioner in the financial markets of focusing on sustainability, is going to be looking at what we can do about greening the future. So lots out there for us to get our teeth into. But most importantly, I'm here to thank you two, Anuka and Toby. And to do so, I have my thanking device. We're unable to open and let the wellspring of the audience come forth. But I have here my Korean karmic clapper. Actually got this from a Korean temple, Bulgoksa, in southeastern Korea. And I will use it to enjoin thanks to all of you. So
thank you, Michael.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. And thank you, everyone.
Thanks to you, Vincent.
Bye-bye.
Take care, everyone. Bye.